Nothing in the equations of physics says that anything should be felt. The wave function evolves. The fields ripple. Particles scatter and bind across 400 billion galaxies across 13 billion years, and every step of this can be written with symbols, predicted with precision, confirmed against instruments that have never once contradicted. The machinery of the universe runs with extraordinary fidelity, and in none of it, not in a single symbol, not tucked inside any constant, not implied by any operation, is there a term for the redness of red. There is no equation for the ache of a long day, no symbol for the taste of cold water, no function that accounts for the plain, undeniable fact that any of it is experienced at all. The universe could have proceeded without this, the atoms colliding, the cells replicating, the signals firing and arriving at their destinations, all of it occurring in complete and perfect darkness, no inner weather, no felt quality to anything, the mechanism operating exactly as it operates, without a witness. Nothing in the laws would be violated. Nothing in the equations would be incomplete. It would just be dark inside, and yet it is not dark. Something knows that it is here. This knowing is not inferred. It is not the conclusion of an argument. It arrives before any argument can be assembled, prior to any judgment about whether it is real, prior to any theory of what it is. The awareness precedes every instrument, every framework, every word that has ever been used to describe it. It was here before any of this began. There have been ordinary moments, nothing special about them, nothing exceptional, where this is felt with sudden clarity. Not the contents of awareness, not the thoughts or the room, the bare fact of it, the awareness itself with no texture, no location, no owner. It simply is, and then the day proceeds, and the strangeness of that noticing recedes. But it was there. It is always there. The problem, the hard, structural 60-century-old problem, is that no one has yet said where it comes from. In 1983, a philosopher named Joseph Levine found a precise name for the gap between what physics can say and what this awareness plainly is. He called it the explanatory gap, the distance between a complete physical description of a process and the felt quality that description is supposed to account for. Take any wavelength of light, measured, categorized, its effects on the visual cortex mapped in fine detail, the signal traced to higher areas, the perception labeled and recorded. Every step of the mechanism is described, and the blue, the precise, specific, irreducible character of the scene, the way that particular seeing actually feels, is still standing outside the description, unaccounted for, not missing from the data, missing from the kind of explanation the data can produce. The physical story is complete on its own terms. The experience is left over, standing outside the explanation, looking in. Some years later, a philosopher named David Chalmers gave the whole problem a name. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, and the name was a quiet provocation because it implied that everything else was easy, and in a sense, everything else is. How the eye detects light, how memory is laid down and retrieved, how attention narrows toward a sound in the dark. These are difficult in the way. That engineering is difficult. They yield to effort. The hard problem does not yield. It has been handed, under different names, to every serious field of human inquiry for more than a century, to physics, to neuroscience, to philosophy, and long before any of those had names, to other kinds of careful investigation whose methods were entirely different, and it sits exactly where it has always sat. This is unsolved, not temporarily, not pending a better instrument. The gap is structural, and here, before the story moves anywhere, something has to be set straight. Because the moment consciousness and physics appear together, A particular claim arrives so quickly and so confidently it has almost become background noise. The claim is this: that quantum mechanics has already solved the problem, that the observer's consciousness collapses the wave function, that the mind, simply by looking, decides what the world will be. The story is appealing. It places awareness at the center of physics. It makes consciousness not a mystery to be explained, but a power that does the explaining. What physics actually says is more strange than that, and it points in a different direction. In 1932, a mathematician named John von Neumann established something rigorous and unsettling about measurement in quantum theory: that the formalism contains no natural place where superposition ends and a definite outcome begins. Any measuring device can itself be treated as a quantum system, measured in turn, and then that device in turn, a chain that the mathematics does not stop. In 1961, the physicist Eugene Wigner briefly proposed that the chain terminates in consciousness, that awareness, being the one thing that cannot be placed in superposition, provides the final settling into definiteness. It was a real proposal by a serious physicist. Wigner later withdrew it himself. The reason was a piece of physics called decoherence, the process by which a quantum system, becoming entangled with the surrounding environment, loses its coherent superposition at timescales so short they have no biological equivalent. The world becomes definite long before any mind arrives to notice. The pointer has already moved. Consciousness reads the result. It does not write it. So that story is set aside, not because consciousness is unimportant, but because the real question is far larger than the comfortable version allows. Not whether the mind shapes the world, why there is a mind at all. A universe that assembled itself by laws that have no term for experience, that produced stars and planets and the chemistry of living cells without any requirement that any of it be felt, should have no requirement by those laws to produce experience. Consider what consciousness is not, by any measurement physics can make. It is not a field. There is no fifth interaction in the standard model labeled awareness. It is not a substance. No instrument has ever measured it directly, only its correlates, the electrical shadows it casts in tissue. No quantity in the physics of a single atom changes when awareness enters or leaves a system. The particle does not know it is seen. The standard model, the most precisely confirmed theory in the history of science, has no variable for the felt. This is not a small omission, and there is nothing in the equations to require that a system, however precisely it replicates every physical detail of a conscious being, should be conscious. The mathematics would be satisfied either way. You have sat in a room at night and felt, without any prompting, that something is present, not a thought about it. The bare noticing, without cause, without explanation. That noticing, unremarkable, so common it goes unnamed, is the one thing in the universe that no theory has yet derived from anything more basic. So where did it come from? There are three ways to hear that question, and they reach different depths. 1S asks how a developing brain, over the slow accumulation of its biology, comes to host an interior. Biology is making real progress on this. The work maps, correlates, and traces mechanisms, and has not yet touched the felt itself. The second asks why any physical process, however intricate, should be accompanied by felt experience at all, rather than simply by more mechanism in the dark. This is the gap Levine described and Chalmers named, and it has not moved. The third is the strangest of the three and the least comfortable. It does not ask where consciousness came from within the universe. It asks whether the question has the order backwards, whether what the equations call the physical world might rest on a ground that has, at its depth, never been without awareness. That third reading is the one most readily refused. It asks too much. It contradicts the intuition that the physical is bedrock and everything else is built on top of it. And yet, some of the most rigorous investigators in modern physics keep arriving at its edge. Not as a welcome conclusion, but as an unwanted implication, something the mathematics keeps requiring, and the physicists keep trying to set aside. And far older than any of that, along a road that used no instruments and followed no equations, others arrived at the same edge from the opposite direction. Long before the word physics existed, there were people who turned attention back on itself, not toward the objects of experience, but toward the awareness that held them. They made this the work of years, of lifetimes. What they were looking for was not consolation, not a comfortable account of the soul. They wanted to see what awareness actually was, stripped of every assumption about it, and they developed methods for this. Precise, transmissible, demanding methods, refined over centuries, and passed carefully from teacher to student, because the territory was thought too easy to misunderstand. In some traditions, this was called the direct path, because it bypassed every conceptual framework and turned inquiry back on the inquiry itself, not asking what the world was made of, asking what the asking was made of. What they found, across traditions that shared no language and no geography, was a family of conclusions so consistently strange that coincidence is not a comfortable explanation. Some of them reported that the awareness they found had no boundary, no inside distinct from an outside, no edge that separated the knowing from the known. Some found that the self they had expected to discover behind the looking was not there, that what had seemed like a personal interior was something that could not be personally owned. Some found that the question of where awareness came from had dissolved, not into an answer, but into a recognition that awareness was not the kind of thing that comes from anywhere, that it did not arrive, that it was, somehow, already the ground. These were not claims made from comfort. They were the results of a method, an investigation, confirmed not against instruments, but against the direct seeing of those who followed the same path with sufficient care and sufficient willingness to be disturbed by what they found. The languages they used are not the languages of physics. The methods are not comparable, and it would be a false move, a cheap move, the kind that costs both fields their precision, to say that one confirms the other, that the ancient findings predicted the physics, that wisdom and science have always been describing the same truth. They have not been describing the same thing. The architectures differ too profoundly for that, but they are standing, each on its own ground, at the edge of the same open question. And the question is the same because it is the oldest one there is. Not where the universe came from, where the knowing of it came from. Two roads, then, one running through the laboratories of the last 100 years toward an observer it cannot eliminate, one running back through the silent rooms of millennia toward an awareness that will not be reduced. They have not met, they may never meet, but they are leaning toward the same threshold from opposite sides, and at the threshold there is only the question, standing as it has always stood, undimmed by every attempt to answer it, the open question, the depth that both roads are pointing at. Whether it has an answer is not yet known, whether it is even the right kind of question, whether the demand for an origin is itself the confusion, whether awareness is not something that arrived, but something that was always already the ground. This, too, is not yet known. The honest position is that the not knowing is not a gap soon to be filled. It is the shape of what is being asked about. In 1974, a philosopher named Thomas Nagel asked a simple question about a creature so ordinary, it seems an odd choice for a philosophical landmark. What is it like to be a bat? A bat navigates in the dark by echolocation. It sends out pulses of ultrasound and reads the returning echoes to build a three-dimensional map of its environment, perceiving at a frequency and with a precision no human sensory apparatus can access. The physics of this is well understood. The neuroscience is not in question. Nagel's point was something else entirely. Even if you knew everything there was to know about a bat's nervous system, every firing pattern, every structure, every biochemical cascade, you would still not know what the bat's experience is like. Not because the data is insufficient, because the data, however complete, is a description of the bat from the outside, and the experience of being a bat is, by definition, from inside. This is what Nagel called the subjective character of experience. His argument, published in the Philosophical Review, was precise. Objective descriptions describe structure and function. They are designed to be descriptions from no particular point of view. But subjective character is a point of view. A description that has no particular perspective cannot contain what having a perspective is like. These are different kinds of things. They do not translate into each other no matter how many facts are added. The argument sounds simple. It has survived 50 years of attempts to dismantle it. No one has dismantled it. Chalmers and Levine, working a decade after Nagel, had named the problem and drawn its boundary lines. What Nagel had done earlier was to describe the interior of the problem with precision, the felt quality of an experience, the specific character of a seen color, of an ache, of a held breath, of the warmth that arrives in the chest at a familiar voice, is not a structural property. It cannot be derived from any structural description. Something in the physical story always falls short of the felt fact, and the falling short is not a matter of incomplete data. It is a matter of category. The two things are not in the same register. Philosophers call these felt qualities qualia, though the word is clinical where what it names is immediate. The redness of red, the sharpness of cold water, the specific, unrepeatable character of a late afternoon in a particular season, in a particular place, experienced by no one else in quite that way. These are not properties that physics measures. They are the properties that make it worth being inside a measurement, rather than being one. The functions can be investigated. They are being investigated with genuine and growing success. How the brain integrates information from the two retinas into a single unified scene. How the prefrontal cortex maintains a goal over seconds and minutes. How attention filters the overwhelming cascade of sensory input into the narrower stream of what is consciously processed. These are not trivial problems. They are yielding slowly to careful work. They describe what the brain does with extraordinary increasing precision, and none of this explains why there is something it is like to do any of it. A visual system that processes and responds and integrates without any felt experience of the scene would not violate any known physical law. A camera does this. The camera receives light, encodes differences, generates a response. No one thinks the camera sees. The question is why the human visual system is different. Not different in its function, but different in having an interior. And nothing in the functional description of the system explains the interior. Not because the description is incomplete, because the interior is not a functional fact. Function runs in the dark or in the light, and the equations do not say which. All of this was philosophy's problem. Abstract, carefully defined, resistant to experiment. And then, in the first decades of the 20th century, physics encountered it from an entirely different direction. The encounter was not sought. It arrived inside the equations, in a part of physics that appeared to have nothing to do with minds at all. Quantum mechanics, as it was assembled in the 1920s and 30s, contained something the founders found deeply uncomfortable. The theory's central object was the wave function, a mathematical structure that evolved smoothly and deterministically, encoding the probabilities of every possible measurement outcome. It could represent a particle in a superposition of multiple positions at once, a photon in a superposition of two polarization states at once, a system in a superposition of having decayed and not yet having decayed. Simultaneously both. The mathematics was clean, the predictions were accurate, and the structure contained, quietly, a problem that would not go away. When a measurement is performed, when a detector registers a particle's position, or a Geiger counter clicks at a decay, the wave function appears to change. Before the measurement, the system is in superposition. After, it is in a definite state. This change is not described by the Schrödinger equation. The Schrödinger equation describes smooth, continuous, deterministic evolution. The change at measurement is sudden, discontinuous, and probabilistic. A separate rule, the Born rule, gives the probabilities of each outcome. The two rules sit next to each other in the formalism. No one has derived one from the other. No one has explained why there are two rules at all. In 1932, the mathematician John von Neumann, who would later design the essential architecture of the modern computer, wrote a book called Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics that examined this with unprecedented rigor. And what he found, when he followed the logic without flinching, was unsettling. The cut between quantum and classical, the boundary where superposition ends and a definite outcome begins, has no fixed location. In the formalism, a particle interacts with a detector, but the detector is itself a physical system. It, too, can be described by a wave function that includes both possible outcomes. The wire carrying the signal from detector to amplifier is a physical system. The amplifier is a physical system. The visual system of the experimenter is a physical system. The brain of the experimenter is a physical system. At no point does the mathematics require the chain to stop. The cut can be placed anywhere without changing the predictions. Von Neumann demonstrated this. You can put the boundary between particle and detector, or between brain and mind, or anywhere in between. The numbers come out the same, which means the location of the cut is arbitrary, which means the theory, for all its predictive power, says nothing about what actually happens when a measurement is made. It gives the probabilities. It does not say why one probability is realized rather than another. It does not say where the quantum world becomes the definite world of pointers and readings and facts. This is sometimes described as a technical puzzle awaiting a technical solution. It is more than that. The two modes of evolution in quantum mechanics, the smooth, deterministic unfolding described by the Schrödinger equation, and the sudden, probabilistic settling that occurs at measurement, are not two aspects of a single underlying process that has simply not yet been identified. They are structurally incompatible. The first is reversible, the second is not. The first preserves superposition, the second eliminates it. No derivation has produced one from the other. They are two laws that live in the same theory and refuse to be unified. The problem has been open since the 1920s. The theory works perfectly. It says nothing about how it works, and the silence is in the structure, not the details. In 1961, a physicist named Eugene Wigner, who had already received the Nobel Prize for his work on symmetry principles in quantum mechanics, wrote an essay called Remarks on the Mind-Body Question. In it, he proposed that the chain von Neumann had described terminates in consciousness. Awareness, Wigner argued, is the one element in the chain that cannot be placed in superposition. A conscious observer always has a definite experience, and therefore consciousness is where the indefinite becomes definite. The collapse is not a physical process in the ordinary sense. It is the act of being witnessed by a mind. He illustrated this with a thought experiment. A friend sealed inside a laboratory with a quantum system. An atom with equal probability of decaying within the hour, connected to a detector, will see either decayed or not decayed on the display. From inside the lab, the friend has a definite experience. But from outside, before Wigner opens the door, the wave function describes the entire system, atom, detector, friend, in superposition, whose wave function is correct. When does the friend's experience become definite? Wigner's answer: when the second observer, Wigner himself, makes his own observation. Consciousness is the termination point of every measurement chain. Wigner later withdrew this proposal, quietly, without formal retraction. The reason came not from philosophy, but from the equations. In 1970, a physicist named Dieter Zeh, working at the University of Heidelberg, published a paper that would change, slowly, how the measurement problem was understood. Zeh pointed out something the founders had not fully reckoned with, that physical systems are never isolated. Every particle, every molecule, every macroscopic object is in constant interaction with its environment, scattering photons, exchanging thermal radiation, colliding with air molecules. Each interaction is itself a quantum interaction. Each one entangles the system with another particle, and that particle with others, spreading the quantum coherence of the system out across an astronomically large number of degrees of freedom. As this entanglement grows, the coherent superposition of the system, the quantum interference that makes it behave differently from a classical ensemble, becomes vanishingly difficult to detect from any accessible perspective. The system appears, to any observer inside the environment, to have definite properties. The superposition has not collapsed in any physical sense, but the coherence has diffused into the environment so thoroughly that it can no longer be witnessed. Wojciech Zurek at Los Alamos National Laboratory developed this into a comprehensive mathematical theory through the 1980s and 90s. He showed how the environment selects certain preferred states, the pointer states, that survive decoherence, while superpositions of those states are destroyed at timescales determined by the strength of the environmental coupling. He called this process environment-induced superselection, selection, and the timescales it predicted were extraordinary. For a grain of dust, decoherence happens in roughly 10 to the negative 36th seconds. For a biological molecule, around 10 to the negative 13th. For any object visible to the naked eye, faster than any physical process on the scale of human experience. The world does not wait for an observer. It settles on its own. But decoherence, and this is the point that most popular accounts miss, does not fully solve the measurement problem. It explains why superpositions are not observed in ordinary experience. It explains why the pointer appears to point to one value. It does not explain why, when the pointer is red, it points to this value and not another. Decoherence produces what looks like a collapse from inside any particular branch of the wave function. But the full quantum state, globally, is still a superposition of all outcomes, each entangled with its environment, each consistent, and each real in the mathematical sense. Why experience selects one branch, what it means for one outcome to be actual while others remain merely probable. This question is still open. Decoherence moves the mystery, it does not dissolve it. The observer was removed from the collapse. The measurement problem remained. And the question of what physics has to say about the nature of experience had to find a different form. In the decades that followed, the problem divided. Most physicists set it aside. The theory worked, the measurements confirmed. The philosophical remainder was not their concern. And in a different part of the academy, in laboratories equipped with different instruments, a parallel investigation was beginning, not into the mathematics of observation, but into the biology of the observer. Francis Crick had already remade science once. In 1953, with James Watson at Cambridge, he had worked out the double helix structure of DNA and changed biology irreversibly. In 1990, nearly 40 years later, he turned his attention to the brain, the question of how the brain produces conscious experience. He wrote with the neuroscientist Christoph Koch, was the central unsolved problem in the scientific understanding of ourselves. And the method he proposed was direct. Find the neural correlates of consciousness, the minimal neural mechanisms specifically sufficient for each conscious percept, not the neural mechanisms of all brain activity, not the mechanisms of unconscious processing, the mechanisms correlated specifically with the moment of experience. The program produced real and detailed findings over the following decades. Crick's original proposal, in that 1990 paper named 40 Hz gamma oscillations, a specific frequency band of synchronized neural firing, as the most promising candidate for the neural correlate of conscious binding. The idea was that consciousness requires the brain to integrate information from many areas simultaneously, and that the 40 Hz rhythm sweeping across the cortex might be the mechanism of that integration. The hypothesis generated enormous research. The findings were mixed. Gamma oscillations correlate with attention and with the contents of awareness. But the correlation is not clean or exclusive, and the oscillation hypothesis has been substantially revised. What the research left behind was a method and a sensibility. Consciousness has a specific neural signature, and that signature can be identified with increasing precision. One of the most productive tools for doing so was binocular rivalry. When different images are shown simultaneously to the two eyes, the brain does not average them. Perception alternates. One image suppresses the other in cycles of a few seconds, and the neural correlates of which image is perceived, not which is delivered to the retina, but which is experienced, could be tracked into higher visual areas, into the temporal lobe, into regions associated with attention and voluntary report. What the eye received was constant. What the brain reported changed. The correlate of the experience, separate from the correlate of the stimulus, was real and measurable. The posterior cortex, a region toward the back of the brain encompassing the visual areas and their neighbors, emerged as a particularly strong correlate of the content of conscious experience. The specificity of the findings was striking. Damage to discrete areas produced discrete gaps. Prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces while still seeing them clearly. Anosognosia, the inability to recognize one's own paralysis. Blindsight, the ability to respond accurately to visual stimuli in a region of the visual field that feels entirely blind. Each syndrome demonstrates the same thing precisely, that conscious experience and neural processing can come apart. The processing continues. The experience, in specific and traceable ways, does not. Crick himself, in the last years before his death in 2004, became focused on a thin structure called the claustrum. Tucked between the cortex and the basal ganglia, its long axons reaching almost every cortical area, its connectivity suggesting to Crick a possible center of conscious binding, the place where the brain's distributed processes might be woven into a unified experience. He was working on a paper about the claustrum in the week before he died. The paper was published posthumously. The claustrum has not proved to be the seat of consciousness, but the question it was trying to answer, how the brain's many parallel processes become one unified experience, is still one of the hardest questions in the field, and throughout all of it, the same limit appeared. Every NCC is a correlation. A correlation is not an explanation. Finding that the conscious perception of blue is accompanied by activity in specific visual areas tells you where the footprint is. It does not tell you why the footprint is accompanied by the felt experience of blue, rather than simply by more neural processing that responds to blue without any felt quality at all. The correlate was found. The origin was not. A correlate is not an origin. This distinction will matter. By the late 1980s, a cognitive psychologist named Bernard Bars had developed a different kind of answer, not to the question of origin, but to the surrounding question of access. His global workspace theory proposed that consciousness is what happens when information enters a shared broadcast medium in the brain, a global workspace that allows otherwise separate modular processing systems to exchange information. Unconscious processing happens in isolated modules, fast and parallel. Conscious experience happens when certain information crosses a threshold and is broadcast globally, becoming available to all the other modules at once. What is on the stage conscious? What remains in the wings is not. Stanislas Dehaene at the Collège de France gave this a neural implementation, the global neuronal workspace, a distributed network of neurons with long-range axons spanning the frontal and parietal cortex, capable of sustained self-amplifying ignition. The model predicted and confirmed that stimuli just below the threshold of conscious report can still prime subsequent behavior, that masking can prevent the global ignition and prevent conscious experience, that general anesthesias disrupts the network and abolishes consciousness while leaving many lower-level processes intact. The theory explains something real. It explains why some information is available for report, for voluntary action, for reasoning, but it does not explain why the broadcast is felt, why the global ignition, when it happens, has an interior. The broadcast could, for all the theory says, happen in complete darkness. The phenomenal question, Nagel's question, the hard problem, is not answered by knowing when the stage is lit. And then came a proposal that moved in precisely the opposite direction. Giulio Tononi, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, began developing integrated information theory in the early 2000s. His starting point was not brain imaging or lesion studies, but phenomenology, the structure of experience itself. Consciousness, he observed, has two properties that any adequate theory must account for. It is integrated. The experience of a red circle in the upper left visual field is one unified experience, not a red thing plus a circular thing, plus a spatial location thing assembled after the fact. It cannot be reduced to the sum of its parts, and it is differentiated. There are an enormous number of distinct possible experiences, each meaningfully different from the others. From these two properties, Tononi derived a mathematical quantity, phi, representing the amount of integrated information a system contains, measured as the difference between the causal power of the whole and the sum of the causal powers of its parts. A system with high phi is more than the sum of its parts. Causally, it generates information as a whole that its parts cannot generate in isolation. And Tononi's central claim is that phi is consciousness, not correlated with it, not produced by it. Phi and consciousness are the same thing, expressed in two different languages. The implication is radical. Under this theory, a thermostat has a small amount of phi, and therefore a small amount of experience. A logic gate has more. The human brain has an enormous amount. Consciousness is not a threshold phenomenon that appears at sufficient complexity. It is a great fundamental property of physical systems, present wherever the causal structure is right. The family resemblance to what philosophers call panpsychism, the view that experience is a basic feature of the physical world, is clear. Tononi resists the label. The resemblance remains. In 2023, a large multi-laboratory collaboration called Cogitate published the results of an adversarial test designed to discriminate between integrated information theory and the global neuronal workspace theory of Deheen. The study was pre-registered. Both teams were involved in specifying the discriminating predictions, and the data collection was unusually thorough. The results were mixed. Neither theory was decisively confirmed. IIT predicted that the neural correlates of conscience should be found primarily in the posterior cortex. GWT predicted frontoparietal involvement. Both signatures were observed in different paradigms in different conditions. The predictions that were supposed to separate the two accounts did not cleanly separate them. The honest assessment is that the question remains open. The field was not quiet about this. In the same year, a letter signed by more than 120 researchers characterized certain formulations of integrated information theory as pseudoscientific, arguing that its central claims were unfalsifiable and that its prominence in public discourse had outrun its evidential support. The response from Tononi's collaborators was vigorous. The debate continues. What it reveals is that consciousness research does not yet know precisely what kind of evidence would settle its central question. The measurement problem in physics has a formal shape. The measurement problem in consciousness research is informal but equally persistent. Consciousness remains, for science, the unresolved center. Every theory has its explanatory reach. Every theory has its limit, and the limit is always the same. It is always the felt interior. All of these approaches, the NCC program, the global workspace, the integrated information, worked within the framework of classical physics. They asked which brain systems, which computational structures, which causal architectures correlate with awareness. In some ways, their findings were precise and real. In other ways, they circled the same wall without finding a door. And a different kind of thinker, trained in geometry and the deep structure of space, began to wonder whether the wall was built in the wrong place entirely. In 1989, a mathematician named Roger Penrose, who had helped prove that black holes are real physical objects, not artifacts of idealized assumptions, published a book called The Emperor's New Mind, and the book contained an argument that was, and remains, genuinely strange. Penrose began with Kurt Gödel and a theorem from 1931 that had changed the foundations of mathematics. Gödel showed that any consistent formal system capable of expressing basic arithmetic must contain statements that are true but cannot be proved within the system. The system can be extended, new axioms added, the unprovable statement made provable, but the extended system will contain its own new unprovable truths. The incompleteness is structural, not temporary. Penrose's interpretation was specific. When a trained mathematician encounters the Gödelian statement, the statement that says, in effect, this cannot be proved in this system, the mathematician can see that it is true, not by deriving it from the axioms, by standing outside the system, understanding what the statement means. Penrose argued, this seeing is not itself an algorithm. If it were, it would be running inside some formal system, and Gödel's theorem would apply to that system in turn, producing new unprovable truths that the mathematician could also see. The regress has no bottom. The seeing is non-algorithmic, and the brain, which does the seeing, must be doing something that no Turing machine can replicate. The argument is contested. Many logicians and philosophers reject Penrose's interpretation, arguing that the mathematician's recognition of the Gödelian truth does not require a non-computable process. The debate has continued without resolution for 30 years. But Penrose's conclusion directed the investigation toward a specific physical territory. If consciousness requires non-computable physical processes, those processes must be somewhere in the physics, somewhere in the unsettled ground between quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity, in the domain of quantum gravity. And if they operate in the brain, they must operate at a scale small enough to preserve quantum coherence against the thermal noise of the biological environment. By the early 1990s, that pointed toward the interior of the neuron, inside every living cell, and most densely in the neurons of the brain. There is a scaffold of hollow protein cylinders that gives the cell its shape, guides its internal transport, and organizes cell division. These are the microtubules discovered in the 1950s, studied carefully since. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, had been thinking about microtubules for years, and from an unusual starting point. Anesthetic gases, structurally diverse molecules with almost nothing in common chemically, all abolished consciousness at low concentrations while leaving most physiological function intact. What were they binding to? Hameroff's work kept pointing toward the cytoskeleton, toward the microtubules. Penrose and Hameroff began a collaboration in the early 1990s that would produce, by 1996, the formal proposal called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, or ORCHA-R. It has a precise architecture, and it is worth stating accurately, because the popular versions frequently miss it. The microtubule is built from protein subunits called tubulin, each of which can exist in slightly different conformational states, different spatial arrangements of the same atoms. Hameroff proposed that these conformational states could exist in quantum superposition, influenced by quantum effects within the protein structure. This is the first component, quantum superposition in the microtubule, controversial but physically coherent. The second component is Penrose's. In standard quantum mechanics, the superposition collapses through decoherence or measurement or some process not yet specified. Penrose proposed something different. That collapse occurs when the superposition involves sufficient mass energy that the two branches produce significantly different curvatures in space-time. The superposition places the geometry of space in an indeterminate state. Space-time cannot remain in two geometries at once. The indeterminacy becomes physically unstable and collapses, not because an observer looks, not because of environmental decoherence in the ordinary sense, but because space-time geometry requires it. This is the objective reduction, a spontaneous physically determined collapse driven by quantum gravity. Each OR event is proposed to be, in itself, a moment of proto-conscious experience, the fundamental grain from which experience is built. The orchestrated part is Hameroff's contribution. The quantum superpositions in microtubules are not random. They are shaped by the synaptic inputs arriving at the neuron, by the biochemical context, by the firing patterns of neighboring cells. The superposition builds in a controlled way, reaches the gravitational threshold, and collapses, producing an OR event that is not isolated but coordinated across many microtubules in many neurons, woven into the organized, unified conscious moment that the brain produces at each instant. The proposal is precise. It is falsifiable in principle. It is also, as both Penrose and Hameroff have consistently acknowledged, highly speculative. No experiment has confirmed quantum superposition of tubulin conformational states in a living neuron. The quantum gravity physics that objective reduction invokes does not yet exist in a fully developed form. ORCH-R is a detailed, serious proposal with a clear mechanism. It is not an established theory. In the year 2000, a physicist named Max Tegmark at the University of Pennsylvania, known for his broad engagement with the foundations of physics, published a paper in Physical Review E that calculated the decoherence timescale for quantum superpositions in the brain. The calculation considered two scenarios: superpositions of individual tubulin conformational states and superpositions of collective states across an entire microtubule. For each, Tegmark estimated the rate at which thermal fluctuations, ionic interactions, and molecular collisions in the cytoplasm would entangle the superposition with the environment. The result was unambiguous. For tubulin conformational superpositions in the brain's warm, wet, electrically noisy environment, the decoherence time was approximately 10 to the minus 13 seconds, roughly 100 femtoseconds. For collective microtubule superpositions, even shorter. Compare this with the timescale of a neural firing event, approximately 1 millisecond, 10 to the minus 3 seconds. The quantum coherence proposed by ORCH-R would be destroyed 10 billion times faster than a single thought takes to form. Not slower, not comparable in any way, 10 billion times faster. The verdict among physicists and neuroscientists following Tegmark's paper was, for most, decisive. The brain is too warm, too wet, too electromagnetically noisy for quantum coherence of any biological significance. Quantum mind, as a physical proposition, was effectively closed. The equations had spoken, and the numbers were not on Hameroff's side. Penrose and Hameroff disputed the calculation, arguing that Tegmark had applied inappropriate parameters, that the cellular environment might differ from its bulk thermal properties in ways relevant to quantum coherence. Their response was not widely accepted. The foundation was now laid. The hard problem had a name and a precise shape. The measurement problem was mapped. Decoherence had been described and its limits traced. The most specific quantum mechanism proposed for conscious experience had been measured against the biology and found incompatible. The search for a neural correlate had found footprints everywhere and an explanation nowhere. The most radical alternative, that consciousness is fundamental, graded, everywhere, had been tested against a rival theory, and the test had not resolved the question. The verdict seemed to point in one direction. Consciousness is a biological phenomenon produced by the brain, and whatever physics might have to say about the universe at small scales, the brain operates at scales too large and too noisy for any of it to matter. And then came the biology. The biology that arrived was not where anyone had thought to look. In the spring of 2007, a team of physicists led by Graham Fleming at the University of California, Berkeley, aimed a laser at one of the most ancient pieces of biochemical machinery on Earth. The FMO complex, named for Fenna, Matthews, and Olson, the three scientists who first described it, is a small protein assembly found in green sulfur bacteria, organisms that have been harvesting light in oxygen-poor water since before the atmosphere carried oxygen at all. These bacteria live in dim, deep environments. They cannot afford to lose much of what they catch. The FMO complex is a molecular antenna. It absorbs light and transfers the excitation to a reaction center, where the chemistry of energy conversion begins. What Fleming's group found, using a technique called two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy, was that the excitation did not move as a classical signal moves, degrading, randomizing, diffusing slowly down a single path. It moved in waves, Quantum interference patterns appeared in the data and persisted for hundreds of femtoseconds at room temperature inside a warm, wet biological protein. The warm-wet argument had said this was impossible. Tegmark's numbers had said this was impossible. Here it was. But biology has a habit of complicating the story that is told about it. Over the decade that followed, the field reassessed what it had found, what Fleming's group had called electronic coherence, the quantum superposition of energy states across the protein, turned out to be, in significant part, vibrational coherence, the quantum behavior of the atomic motion of the protein, rather than purely the electronic states. The distinction matters. Electronic coherence would have been a demonstration of quantum computing in biological tissue. Vibrational coherence is still quantum. But the claim that photosynthesis runs a quantum algorithm was probably an overreach. A careful review of the field in 2020 found that quantum effects in warm biological systems are real. But their functional significance, whether coherence makes the process more efficient or is simply a feature of the protein dynamics, remains open. The strong version of the claim did not survive. The observation did. Quantum coherence in a warm, wet, living system is real, not impossible. That was the finding that mattered. The discovery happened not in a neuron and not in a brain. In a single-celled organism without a nervous system, an ancient creature in an ancient sea doing chemistry in the dark. The quantum world had already found its way into living matter by a route that had nothing to do with consciousness. That was its own kind of news, and it was enough to change the question. In 1978, a physicist named Klaus Schulten proposed something his colleagues found improbable. He suggested that migratory birds navigate by exploiting the quantum mechanical properties of a pair of electrons. The European robin migrates thousands of kilometers twice a year, guided in part by the Earth's magnetic field. The problem is that the field is extraordinarily weak, roughly 50 microtesla at the surface, about 1,000 times weaker than the field of a refrigerator magnet. No known classical biological sensor can detect a field this weak, and yet the robin tracks it with precision, using it not just as a compass but as an inclination sensor, sensitive to the angle of the field lines, relative to the horizon which encodes latitude. Classical physics had no explanation for how this was possible. Schulten thought quantum mechanics might. The mechanism works as follows. In the retina of certain birds, a protein called cryptochrome absorbs blue light and undergoes a reaction that creates what physicists call a radical pair. Two separate molecules, each carrying an unpaired electron, both electrons initially entangled, their spin states correlated across the space separating the two molecules. The pair exists for a brief window before recombination. In that window, something precise happens. The Earth's magnetic field, weak as it is, influences the rate at which the radical pair converts between its two possible spin configurations. Different rates produce different chemical products. Different products generate different signals in the retina. The bird, in effect, perceives the magnetic field not as a separate sensation, as a modulation of its visual experience of the world. For decades, this remained a proposal. Then the experiments confirmed it. Henrik Ritz and colleagues, and separately the Wilczko Laboratory in Frankfurt, showed that European robins exposed to weak oscillating radio frequency fields at a specific frequency, precisely the frequency that would disrupt radical pair spin dynamics, lost their magnetic compass sense entirely. Other forms of magnetic interference, which would disrupt a classical compass needle but not a radical pair, had no effect. The result was specific. It was repeatable. Classical mechanisms could not explain it. There is something worth pausing on. A robin in flight, crossing continents by memory and by some ancient pull toward warmer latitudes, is carrying in its eye a quantum state, two entangled electrons, sensitive to an invisible geometry. The Earth's magnetic field does not pull on a needle in the bird's head. It steers the quantum chemistry of a protein in the retina, and from that steering, across a cascade the bird cannot observe, comes a form of seeing that no instrument has yet replicated, quantum coherence in a warm, living eye, sustained long enough to be useful. The significance of this for the broader argument is not small. The warm, wet argument, the argument that Tegmark had put into precise mathematical form and that had seemed so decisive, was not wrong about quantum mechanics. It was wrong about biology. The biological environment is more structured, more sheltered in specific ways than a thermal bath of equivalent temperature. Life has had 4 billion years to find pockets of coherence in the noise. It appears to have found them, not once, several times. This does not say anything about the brain, not yet, but it changes the shape of the question. What this does and does not mean is worth saying plainly before going further. Quantum effects in warm biological systems are documented. The radical pair mechanism in avian navigation is the strongest case. What this establishes is a proof of principle. Quantum coherence is not automatically destroyed by the biological environment. What it does not establish is anything specific about neurons, or microtubules, or consciousness. The door that Tegmark appeared to close was not fully closed, that is all. The door is open, not wide open, open. Against this background, the microtubule question looked different, not answered. Different. Penrose and Hameroff had continued working on Orcaor through the years after Tegmark's critique, arguing that his calculation had used parameters that may not accurately represent the interior of the microtubule, which is a more structured environment than a bulk thermal bath. Stuart Hameroff had been building an independent line of evidence from anesthesia. Volatile anesthetic gases, the compounds surgeons use to induce unconsciousness, share no common chemical structure. Halothane and xenon and sevoflurane belong to entirely different molecular families. There is no single receptor they could all be acting on by conventional pharmacological logic, and yet all of them, at similar concentrations, reliably abolish consciousness. What they share is the ability to bind within the hydrophobic pockets of proteins, including tubulin. If something about tubulin is involved in consciousness, and anesthetics act on tubulin, the correlation is not trivial. Experimental work has added threads to this line of inquiry. Drugs that stabilize microtubule structure appear, in rodent studies, to alter the timing of anesthetic-induced loss of consciousness, animals losing or regaining awareness at different rates, depending on the state of the microtubule network. And separately, Philip Kurian at Howard University and colleagues have been investigating what physicists call superradiance, a quantum optical effect in which multiple emitters interacting coherently radiate more intensely than they would in isolation. The proposal is that the tryptophan residues within tubulin, which absorb ultraviolet light, may exhibit superradiant collective behavior under biological conditions, suggesting that the electronic states in microtubule networks have more quantum character than purely classical models would predict. Here is what the evidence establishes and what it does not. The two things are not the same. What it establishes. The decoherence argument is not settled. The biological environment is complex enough that the possibility of partial quantum shielding in microtubule interiors is not ruled out. The anesthesia correlation is real and is not explained by known receptor mechanisms. The superradiance proposal is testable and has not been refuted. What it does not establish, that Orcaor is correct, that quantum effects in microtubules produce consciousness, that quantum mind is vindicated. None of this follows from the evidence. The popular version of this story, that recent biology has confirmed quantum consciousness, is not accurate. The evidence is suggestive. The conclusion is not in the evidence. The door is open. It is not wide open. What cannot now be said is that it is shut. But even granting everything, even if the quantum coherence in the microtubule is confirmed at every scale, even if the mechanism turns out to be exactly as Penrose and Hameroff proposed, there remains a question that no mechanism can answer. The mechanism describes what the brain does. It does not say why what the brain does is felt. A correlate is not an origin. A mechanism is not a meaning. This has been named already. It needs to be named again here, because it is the ground the rest of this stands on. If consciousness is fundamental, if it is not produced by the brain, but organized by it, present in small degrees, wherever there is a system with the right causal structure, then a great deal follows. The brain need not conjure experience from nothing. It only concentrates and shapes experience that was already there in the fabric of things. This is in some ways the most economical solution to the hard problem, and it immediately creates another problem, deeper in some ways than the one it was supposed to solve. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University, whose book Consciousness and Fundamental Reality set out the most careful contemporary defense of panpsychism, calls it the combination problem. If an electron has a minimal experience, a tiny degree of something it is like to be, and a neuron has more, and the brain has rich and unified experience, what determines how the smaller experiences combine into the larger? Why does a brain produce one unified field of awareness rather than billions of separate micro-experiences happening simultaneously in isolation? The difficulty is not simply quantitative. You can add objects to get a larger collection. You cannot add subjects to get a single subject. The experience of a color is unified, one experience from one perspective. A billion infinitesimal experiences, however tightly packed, do not obviously yield one. They yield a billion experiences adjacent. The step from many to one has not been taken. It is sometimes called the subject summing problem. If you sum 10 quantities, you get a larger quantity. If you sum 10 distances, you get a longer distance. But if you sum 10 experiencers, you do not obviously get one experiencer that is richer than each. You get 10 experiencers. The mathematics of summation does not have a term for the emergence of a single unified subject from many. No one has written that equation. Quantum entanglement is sometimes proposed as the bridge. Entangle the components, and perhaps their experiences are somehow entangled too. But this imports into consciousness a kind of correlation that has no established equivalent in the physics of entanglement. Entanglement correlates measurement outcomes. Whether there is a form of experiential correlation analogous to quantum correlation, whether the quantum world provides a mechanism for the unity of experience is an open question, not an answered one, a gesture toward an answer, not the answer itself. The combination problem does not often appear in popular accounts of quantum consciousness or panpsychism. It should. It is the most structurally deep challenge to the most elegant escape from the hard problem, and it remains open. There is a moment sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, nothing remarkable happening, no particular demand on attention, when the visual field seems briefly noticeable as a thing. The table, the window, the light, all present simultaneously, arrived whole, not assembled piece by piece. The unified scene was not constructed from components. It was given all at once. The combination problem asks how, and the asking does not yet have an answer. In the 1970s and 80s, John Wheeler, who named the black hole and the wormhole, who spent decades pressing on the foundations of general relativity, became preoccupied with a question that would not leave him. He had spent most of his career working outward, toward space-time, toward the beginning of the universe. In his later years, he turned inward, toward information, toward the act of asking. Wheeler proposed what he called the delayed choice experiment. A photon enters an apparatus with a beam splitter that sends it along two possible paths. If both paths are open and both detectors are in place, the photon travels as a wave, taking both paths simultaneously, and the two paths interfere. If one path is blocked, the photon travels as a particle. Standard quantum mechanics. Nothing new so far. The delayed part. After the photon has passed through the beam splitter, after it has entered the apparatus, and, in some sense, committed to its behavior, the choice of whether to detect wave or particle behavior is made randomly. The choice comes after, and yet the photon responds correctly to a choice that had not been made when it entered. A group including Alain Aspect in Paris confirmed this experimentally in 2007. The result was unambiguous. Wheeler was careful about what he concluded. He was not saying the future changes the past. He was saying something stranger. The photon's path, which route it took, is not a property the photon possesses independently. It becomes a property only when the apparatus is configured to ask about it. The question and the answer are not separate events. The act of asking is part of what determines the answer. He called this the participatory universe, not that the mind makes the world. Wheeler refused this reading consistently and with emphasis, something more precise. The universe at the quantum level does not have definite properties independently of acts of measurement. The observer is not outside the observed. They are woven together by the structure of the measurement. The universe is, in some sense, Wheeler found himself unable to fully specify, co-constituted by the questioning. He extended this toward a proposal he called it from bit, that physical existence at its deepest level derives from information, from answers to yes or no questions, not things at the bottom of reality, but questions and answers, and the act of answering not separate from the universe being answered. The implication is not comfortable. If the universe acquires definite properties through acts of questioning, and if those questions are posed by observers, then the observers are not passengers arriving late in a universe that already existed independently. They are woven into what the universe is, not in the sense that they invent it, which Wheeler refused, but in the sense that the universe is having definite properties at the quantum level is not separable from its being questioned. The universe participates in its own questioning. The observer participates in the universe. The separation that classical physics assumed, subject here, object there, a clean boundary between them, is not, at the quantum level, how things are. Wheeler spent the last decades of his life turning this over. He never resolved it to his satisfaction. He said so. This was not mysticism. This was the conclusion of 60 years of foundational physics, arrived at slowly, held carefully, not comfortable, not dismissed. A generation after Wheeler, a group of physicists made a more radical proposal. Not just that the observer cannot be removed from the formalism, that the formalism is, at its foundation, about the observer. Christopher Fuchs, working with colleagues through the 2000s, developed an interpretation called cubism. Its core claim is simple, and its implications are not. The wave function is not a description of an objective physical reality. It is an agent's personal expectation, a representation of what that agent, given everything they know, anticipates observing. When the wave function appears to collapse, when a measurement produces a definite outcome, nothing physical has happened. An agent has received information and updated their beliefs. The collapse is not an event in the world. It is the moment of learning. This dissolves the measurement problem. The strangeness that generated a century of debate came from treating a belief representation as if it were a physical object, and then wondering what physical process the object was undergoing. Remove the confusion, and the problem does not need to be solved. It was the wrong question. David Mermin, the Cornell physicist who gave the phrase, "shut up and calculate," to the culture of quantum mechanics, and who spent the last decades of his career arguing that this had been exactly the wrong advice, became one of Cubism's most articulate advocates. He argued that Cubism restores something physics had long treated as an inconvenience, the experiencing subject, not as a philosophical afterthought, as the entity the formalism is fundamentally about. Physics, on Cubism's reading, is not a theory of the world in general. It is a theory of how an agent navigates their experience of the world. The objection is real. If the wave function is personal, what grounds the objectivity of physics? If each agent has their own wave function, why do physicists across different laboratories agree on their results? Fuchs's answer: there is a quantum world, something real and independent that all agents are navigating. But the wave function is not a direct representation of it. It is the interface, not the territory. All agents share the territory, even though they approach it with different interfaces. What the territory actually is, in itself, is not described by the formalism. The formalism is silent on this. The hard problem returns, now inside the physics. Cubism places the experiencing subject at the center of the formalism, and then leaves the question of what the subject is, what experience is, where it comes from, entirely open. The problem has not been solved. It has been relocated to exactly where the physics cannot follow it, and the relocation is significant. It is one thing to say that consciousness is a residue left over from a physics that otherwise works without it. It is another to say that the physics does not work without it, that the formalism requires an agent, requires someone for whom the probabilities are personal, requires a perspective from which the born rule is applied. On Cubism's account, consciousness is not the leftover. It is the starting point, and the question of what it is has been handed, very carefully and very deliberately, to whatever comes after physics. What that means, what kind of inquiry might take up the question where physics sets it down, is not a question. Cubism answers, physics has arrived from multiple directions at a question it cannot resolve from inside its own methods. The quantum biology is real. The participatory universe is a serious proposal. Cubism places the experienced at the center of its formalism, and not one of these moves has explained why there is a subject, why there is something it is like to be the agent whose beliefs the physics is about. Each approach has moved closer to the question. None has crossed the threshold into an answer. The threshold may not be crossable from this side. Here is the honest position, stated as precisely as the evidence allows. Quantum effects in warm biological systems are documented. The radical pair mechanism in avian navigation is the strongest case. Quantum coherence in photosynthesis is real, its functional significance still being assessed. The microtubule question is open. The door Tegmark appeared to close is not fully closed. The participatory universe and Cubism are serious positions held by serious physicists. The combination problem for panpsychism is unsolved. The measurement problem is unsolved. The hard problem is unsolved. Not one of these findings explains why there is experience. Not one of the interpretations, not Cubism, not the participatory universe, not Orkor, has derived the felt quality of any experience from first principles. The wave function as belief still requires a believer. The participatory universe still requires a participant. The quantum coherence in the microtubule, if confirmed, still requires an account of why coherence is accompanied by anything felt. The findings change the landscape. They do not cross the threshold. There is a fact that sits beneath all of this and does not move. It is not a theory. It is not an interpretation. Sometimes, perhaps in a quiet moment, with nothing demanding attention, the fact of being aware becomes briefly visible. Not thoughts, not perceptions, the awareness that holds them. This is not produced by any theory. It is not confirmed by any experiment. It precedes both. And no theory, in all the decades of work on this problem, has derived it from anything more basic than itself. What physics has done, at its frontier, is take this seriously. The interpretation that keep the observer inside the formalism, that refuse to treat the first-person fact as a disposable residue, are not bad physics. They are careful physics. They follow the implications without flinching. And what they have found, at the end of those implications, is that the question of what an observer is, what it means for anything to have a perspective, a felt interior, a point of view, is a question that the physics the observer is the basis of cannot answer. The mathematics is consistent. The experiments are verified. The interpretations multiply. And what reality is actually doing when the equations are satisfied, what the wave function is about, what the observer is, why a universe without experience in its foundations seems to require, at those foundations, something that experiences, is genuinely open. Not open because the right instrument is missing. Open at the level of what kind of answer would count. Physics, at its frontier, has arrived at the edge of what physics can say. There is a different kind of investigation, as old as human language, that arrived at the same edge from the other side. It left no data in the ordinary sense. It used no instruments. Its practitioners did not form journals or review each other's findings in any form that physics would recognize as verification. What they produced was a kind of precision available only through sustained first-person inquiry, through the turning of attention back on itself, years deep, sometimes decades, in conditions designed specifically to strip away what was not essential. They were called by different names in different cultures. Their methods were different. Their premises were different. And the findings they recorded pressed through the conceptual languages available to each tradition into whatever form those traditions could hold. Keep arriving at what looks, held carefully at a distance, like the same structural edge that physics has spent a century approaching from the outside. This convergence must be held with care. These traditions were not doing physics. They were not predicting quantum mechanics. What follows is not a claim that ancient wisdom has been vindicated by modern science, or that the mystics knew what the physicists have only now found. That framing is precisely the one that must be refused, because it collapses two different kinds of investigation into one, and in doing so, it damages both. The contemplative traditions arrived at their findings by methods physics cannot evaluate. Physics arrived at its frontier by methods the contemplatives neither used nor sought. The languages are different. The methods are incomparable. The structure is the same. And the structure is specific enough, not vague convergence on all is one, but a specific architectural pattern, precise enough to be named that it is worth examining. In the 4th and 5th centuries, in the region of what is now northwestern India and Pakistan, two brothers turned the entire discipline of Buddhist philosophy in a new direction. Asanga and his younger sibling Vasubandhu, both trained in the Abhidharma tradition. The meticulous philosophical analysis of experience that Indian Buddhism had developed over centuries arrived by meditation and by argument at a proposal that would make them among the most influential and most disputed thinkers in Buddhist history. The proposal was this: what we take to be a world of external objects encountered by a subject is always already an appearance within consciousness. Not because consciousness invents what appears, they were careful here, but because the seemingly solid externality of things is a feature of how consciousness presents appearances, not a feature of things in themselves. The school they founded is called Yogacara, the practice of yoga, and its most technically dense contribution is not the claim about external reality, but the theory of the 8 consciousnesses, and in particular the 8th. 6 of the 8 are familiar in form. The 5 sense consciousnesses process what the senses deliver. The 6th, the mental consciousness, thinks, imagines, remembers. The 7th, the manas, the afflicted mind, takes the 8th consciousness as if it were a self, fabricating the illusion of a separate ego from material that is not actually a self at all. The source of the ego illusion, in the Yogacara account, is the manas mistaking its own substrate for a person, and the 8th, the foundation consciousness, alaya vijnana. Beneath all 7 operating consciousnesses, there is a substrate that carries the seeds of past experience, not as stored memories, but as subtle dispositions that condition what will arise next, how the world will be experienced, what patterns of response will emerge. The alaya is impersonal. It is not a self or a soul. It is a stream, flowing moment by moment, carrying the traces of all that has been experienced and conditioning the arising of what comes next. Vasubandhu lays this out in the Trimsika, the 30 verses on consciousness only, with precision that rewards close reading. The popular version of this teaching reduces the alaya vijnana to a cosmic storehouse mind, a universal consciousness available for spiritual access, a pool of divine knowing that the practitioner can tap into. The actual teaching says something closer to its opposite. The alaya vijnana is the deepest layer of samsaric mind, the deepest layer of the conditioned, karmic, cyclic mind that the Buddhist path aims to transform. The tradition is explicit. The alaya is not the Buddha nature. It is not enlightened mind. It is the substrate of the unenlightened condition, carrying the seeds that perpetuate it. Connecting with the alaya is not liberation. It is touching the root of the problem. Vasubandhu describes the aim of practice as ashraya paravritti, the turning of the basis, a complete transformation of the foundation consciousness into a form of luminous knowing, not a merger with it as it currently is. What is architecturally interesting here is the move itself. Beneath the surface operations of mind, beneath perception, thought, emotion, and memory, there is a substrate layer whose activity conditions what the surface encounters. The surface mind does not have transparent access to its own ground. The manas mistakes the ground for a self. The practitioner's task is to see through the mistake and transform what was found. This is the same structural direction as looking beneath the neural correlates of consciousness for a physical substrate that explains them. Moving downward beneath the apparent toward whatever conditions the apparent. The specific answers differ completely. The Yogacara finds a karmic stream. The neuroscientist finds tissue. The physicist looks below both. But the direction beneath the surface toward what conditions it is structurally shared. The languages are different. The direction of inquiry is the same. Vasubandhu describes the alaya as flowing like a great river, not a still lake, not a fixed container, but a current that carries seeds of past experience, releases them as new experience arises, and receives the traces of that new experience in turn. Not static, not self-identical, not a ground in the architectural sense. A movement through time that shapes what arises from it, and is shaped by what arises into it. There is nothing fixed at the bottom. The substrate is itself a process. A different tradition, in a later time and place, carried the inquiry further, past the substrate, past the question of what conditions the surface mind, to the question of what awareness itself is. In the 14th century, in the Himalayan region of Tibet, a teacher named Longchenpa, whose full Tibetan name means something like vast expanse of infinite qualities, systematized what may be the most radical contemplative teaching in the tradition. He was not speculating. He was describing something he took to be directly recognizable through specific conditions as a first-person fact. He wrote precisely, voluminously, and with a quality of description that is unlike almost anything else in the literature of contemplative experience. The teaching is Dzogchen, the great perfection, and its central distinction is between two things that look, from outside, like they might be the same thing. Ordinary dualistic mind, sems, is the mind that thinks, perceives, judges, reacts, desires, fears. It is the mind of ordinary experience, the mind used to read and reason and worry. Pure awareness, Rigpa, is not a different mind. It is the nature of mind, which the constant operations of sems simultaneously manifest and obscure. Sems is mind that refers. It always takes something as its object. It is structured as subject perceiving object. Rigpa is awareness without reference. It has no object. It is not a subject perceiving something else. It is. And here the tradition's language acknowledges its own limit. Prior to the subject-object structure, awareness before awareness divides into a knower and a known. The tradition describes the primordial ground, Gji, from which both sems and rigpa appear to arise, in terms of three qualities. Its essence is empty, having no fixed or independent nature. Its nature is luminous, self-illuminating, not dark. Its responsiveness is spontaneous, arising in relation to what arises without effort or contrivance. These three are not separate properties. They are three orientations toward one thing that cannot be adequately approached from any single direction. What the lineage transmission of Dzogchen guards carefully, and what popular accounts almost entirely omit, is the precise way in which Rigpa cannot be approached from the position of sems. If ordinary mind attempts to find Rigpa, ordinary mind is doing what ordinary mind does, reaching, seeking, acquiring. The reaching is itself the movement away from what is sought. The pointing out instruction, Go Sprad Pa, that the qualified teacher offers the student is not a technique for achieving Rigpa. It is a gesture that produces recognition. The recognition is not of something new. It is the recognition that the awareness in which the looking was already happening is what was being sought. Longchenpa, in his precious treasury of the basic space of phenomena, describes this as the practitioner's fundamental error. Not looking in the wrong place, but looking for something that could be found and approached from outside. The ground is not a destination. It is the already the case from which every destination arises. What Dzogchen refuses to do, and what the hard problem of physics also refuses to do, through completely different means and for completely different reasons, is to derive awareness from something more basic than awareness. The hard problem says, consciousness cannot be derived from the physical. The physical description is always incomplete by the measure of the felt. Dzogchen says, Rigpa cannot be derived from the operations of sems. It is unproduced, already the case, prior to causation. Both refusals are load-bearing. The languages could not be more different. The methods are incomparable. The structure is the same. Longchenpa's precious treasury of the basic space of phenomena describes the ground of awareness as open like the sky, vast, without center or edge, not a container for what appears within it, but the openness within which appearance and recognition are inseparable. He is careful, This is not a metaphor for psychological spaciousness. He is describing what he takes to be an ontological fact about the nature of mind, one accessible under specific conditions to direct recognition. The sky metaphor breaks down as he acknowledges, because a sky can be seen from outside, while the ground he is describing cannot. Every description points towards something that exceeds the description. The same refusal to derive awareness from anything more basic appears in the oldest continuous philosophical tradition in the world, by a road that uses neither quantum mechanics nor Himalayan practice. In the 8th century in southern India, a philosopher named Adi Shankaracharya systematized a reading of the Upanishads called Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual end of wisdom. The word Advaita means not two, not one in the sense of a homogeneous unity, but not two in the sense of the absence of the ultimate division that the mind constantly performs between self and other, between inside and outside. The text he returned to most often was the Mandukya Upanishad, 12 verses, one of the shortest and most technically demanding in the whole Upanishadic literature, devoted entirely to the analysis of the syllable aum and the states of consciousness. It names 3 ordinary states: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and a fourth, turiya. The fourth is not a fourth state alongside the other 3. It is the witness consciousness that pervades and underlies all 3. It cannot be defined in terms of the 3 states, because it is what the 3 states appear within. Shankara's predecessor in the tradition, Gaudapada, wrote the Mandukya Karika, 4 chapters of verse commentary that are the founding document of Advaita. In the 4th chapter, the Alatasanti, Gaudapada made a claim that the Indian philosophical tradition found deeply unsettling and has argued about since, that waking experience and dream experience are, from the perspective of the highest teaching, ontologically equivalent. Not that waking is unreal in the sense of being hallucinated, but that the framework within which real and unreal are distinguished. The waking framework is itself an appearance within consciousness. The claim is more demanding than the usual reading of Advaita. It says that the ground from which all 3 states appear, turiya, is not reachable by privileging the waking state over the dream state. Both are equally appearances. And from the Chandogya Upanishad, among the oldest of all the Upanishads, comes the instruction that has been more widely quoted and more consistently misunderstood than almost any statement in Indian philosophy. You are that, Tat Tavam Asi, is the culmination of a series of teaching exchanges between a father, Uddalaka Aruni, and his son Shvetaketu in the 6th chapter of that text. Uddalaka works through example after example to show that what the son takes to be his separate self has, at its deepest root, the same nature as what the sun takes to be the independent ground of all things. The identity is not of the ego with the cosmos. It is of the awareness at the base of experience, with the awareness at the base of existence. The ego, the thing that would feel pleased to be told it is cosmic, is precisely what dissolves in the recognition. The instruction is not flattery. It is the most demanding kind of undoing. The structural parallel to Cubism's agent and Wheeler's participant is clear. Consciousness is not a product of the world. The world is an appearance within consciousness. The architectural claim is the same. The methods are incomparable. But Advaita, for all its precision, left a question at its own foundation. If consciousness is the ground, why does the ground appear divided? Why does the one awareness appear as billions of separate perspectives, each convinced of its own separateness? A school working in the Kashmir Valley from the 9th to the 12th century CE had the most detailed answer to this question. It was also the most disturbing. The recognition philosophy, Pratyabhijna, was developed by Somananda in the 9th century, refined by his student Utpaladeva, and brought to its fullest articulation by Abhinavagupta, who lived and worked around the turn of the first millennium. His masterwork, the Tantraloka, runs to 37 chapters of dense philosophical and practical instruction and is not easy in any sense. The central claim, consciousness, Samvit, is the ultimate reality characterized by two inseparable qualities. Luminosity, prakasha, is the shining forth nature of consciousness, the fact that it illuminates what it touches, including itself. Self-reflective awareness, vimarsha, is consciousness's knowing of itself, the I quality that is inseparable from the luminosity. Consciousness is not just light. It is light that knows itself as light. Why then does the individual self experience itself as limited, as finite, as separate from a world that seems to be other? The Pratyabhijna tradition names 5 specific contractions, 5 kanchukas, through which the unlimited appears to become limited. Infinite power contracts into limited capacity. Omniscience contracts into partial knowledge. Perfect completeness contracts into desire. Eternity contracts into temporal sequence. Omnipresence contracts into spatial location. These 5 contractions, wrapped in the further principle of differentiation, produce the ordinary sense of being a bounded subject in a world of other objects. This is not an error to be corrected. It is the infinite consciousness exercising its own freedom, swatantraya, to appear as a specific, limited perspective. The world is the infinite appearing to itself in this constrained form. And here, something must be said plainly, because the popular version of this teaching and of the other non-dual teachings in this section has traveled far from where it originated, and in the traveling has been turned into its opposite. It is said in popular spirituality that you are pure consciousness, that you create your reality, that your thoughts shape the world, that remembering your cosmic nature is a matter of intention and belief, and that reclaiming this cosmic identity is both the spiritual goal and a practical tool for getting what you want from life. This claim is available in hundreds of books, courses, and platforms. It has the word non-duality attached to it with increasing frequency. It cites these traditions by name. The actual teaching says something different, more demanding, more disturbing, and in the relevant sense, the opposite. The entity that would do the remembering, the self that is supposed to reclaim its cosmic nature, is, on the tradition's own account, the contraction. The ego is not the container of infinite consciousness waiting to be recognized. The ego is the contraction away from it. And the tradition consistently and explicitly teaches not the enthronement of the ego in cosmic consciousness, but the dissolution of the very sense of separate agency that would want to do the enthronement. The limited self cannot, by an act of its own will, unlimit itself. This is exactly what the contraction would do, because the contraction and the will are the same thing. You cannot use the mechanism of limitation to escape limitation. The recognition that Abhinavagupta describes is not something the ego achieves. It is what happens when the ego's claim to be a separate, autonomous agent is seen through. The self-help version of non-dual teaching is the ego's strategy for annexing the teaching's prestige. The teaching itself is the dissolution of the strategy. These are not two versions of the same thing. They are in direct opposition. The structural parallel to physics is specific. Cubism places the experiencing agent, the one whose perspective the wave function belongs to, inside the architecture of the physics rather than outside it. The observer is not a philosophical residue. It is load-bearing. Kashmir Shaivism makes a structurally analogous claim. The individual subject is not a mistake to be eliminated, but the infinite consciousness itself, appearing in a specific constrained form, constitutive of the world it appears to face. Both traditions refuse to explain the subject away. Both locate subjectivity inside the architecture of reality. The languages are different. The structure is the same. The same movement, a ground that knows itself through the medium of specific limited forms, arrived in the 12th and 13th centuries in a completely different world and by a completely different road. Muhyiddin ibn Arabi was born in Murcia in Andalusia in 1165 and died in Damascus in 1240. In the 75 years between, he read everything, traveled everywhere, and produced a metaphysical system so dense and so precisely articulated that the Orthodox Islamic establishment spent the following 6 centuries trying to suppress or sanitize it. The Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Illuminations, is his major work, hundreds of chapters on every dimension of the Islamic mystical universe. The Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, is shorter, 27 chapters, and has generated more commentary than almost any other text in the Sufi tradition. His central principle is the unity of being, Wahdat al-Wujud. There is one being, al-Wujud, which is self-manifest, self-knowing, self-disclosing. The multiplicity of the world is real as self-disclosure. No thing is ultimately separate from being. No thing can simply be identified with being, as if being were just a larger thing. What most popular accounts of Ibn Arabi reduce to comfortable mysticism is the precise ontological machinery. Before anything manifests in the world, the things that will manifest exist as what Ibn Arabi calls the fixed entities, al-ayan al-thabita, within the divine self-knowledge. These are not separate beings. They have no independent existence. They exist as determinate forms within the divine knowing. The patterns according to which the one being will disclose itself. Ibn Arabi uses a phrase that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The fixed entities are the things that never smell the fragrance of existence. They are eternal in the divine knowledge, and they are nothing. Being belongs to God. The entities receive existence. They do not possess it as their own. The world, on this account, is not created by a craftsman working on pre-existing materials. It is the self-knowledge of the Absolute taking specific determinate form. The cosmos is not something the divine made. It is something the divine is, appearing to itself through the medium of the fixed entities, in the specific forms those entities make possible. Between the purely spiritual and the fully material, Ibn Arabi posits the intermediate realm, the Barzakh, and within it what he calls the presence of imagination, Hadrat al-Khayal. This is not psychological fantasy. It is an ontological category, a level of reality between the purely intelligible and the fully sensory, where possibilities take form before they take matter. The prophetic tradition has access to this level not because prophets have vivid inner experiences, but because the imaginal realm is a real dimension of cosmic structure that specific forms of attention can, under specific conditions, perceive. The Orthodox tradition found this dangerous, not because it was vague, but because it was precise. If there is an ontological level between the divine and the material, the absolute line between creator and creation, between transcendence and immanence, requires re-examination. Ibn Arabi's teaching was not condemned for being mystically imprecise. It was condemned for being too clear about what it implied. The structural parallel to Wheeler's participatory universe is exact in one dimension. In Wheeler, the universe's having definite properties is not separable from its being questioned by an observer. The act of asking is woven into the structure of the answer. In Ibn Arabi, the cosmos's having determinate form is not separable from its being a mode of the divine self-knowledge. The world is the form in which the Absolute encounters itself through the medium of specific, limited perspectives. The knowing and the known are not two separate events. They are one movement appearing in two aspects. Physics did not confirm this. This did not predict the physics. The structure rhymes. And centuries before Ibn Arabi, in a Dominican priory in what is now Germany, a preacher found the same structural edge by the road of Latin theology and Christian prayer. Meister Eckhart, who lectured in Paris and preached in Cologne in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, made a distinction that almost no popular account of Christian mysticism transmits. He distinguished between God, the personal, relational divine, the creator, the providential ruler, and the Godhead. What the divine is in itself, prior to all relation, prior to all attribute, prior to even the name God. He called it the desert of the Godhead, featureless, trackless, beyond being in any determinate sense. Not emptiness in the Buddhist sense, not non-being in the Taoist sense. Something for which medieval Latin had no term that did not mislead. And the ground of the soul, the grunt, the spark, the funk line, is not, Eckhart preached, a created thing. It is not finite, it is not produced, and it is, at its deepest point, identical with the divine ground. Not approaching it, not imitating it, identical. Pope John XC condemned Eckhart's claims posthumously in 1329 in a bull called In Agro Dominico. The condemnation targeted this specifically, the claim that the soul's ground and the divine ground are the same. What the ecclesiastical authority could not allow was a version of Christian teaching in which the boundary between creator and creature was less than absolute. Eckhart's response, in the defense he filed before his death, was that he was speaking of the soul's ground prior to created existence, of something in the soul that was never, in the relevant sense, made. What Eckhart is pointing at is the unproduced foundation beneath the created itself. It parallels, structurally, the Dzogchen claim of Rigpa as prior to production and the hard problem's refusal to derive experience from physical description, the ground that is not made. The three traditions, Tibetan Buddhist, medieval Christian, Western physical, arrived at the same structural claim by roads that never crossed, the same inquiry into what lies beneath the produced, beneath the named, beneath the surface, appears in a text so old and so compressed that it has been read by two traditions as describing two mutually incompatible things. The Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and its virtue, is attributed to Lao Tzu, the old master, a figure whose historicity is uncertain and whose image in the tradition ranges from historical philosopher to cosmic archetype. The text is 81 short chapters, totaling roughly 5,000 Chinese characters, and it is one of the most consistently misread texts in the contemplative literature. In the 3rd century CE, a young Chinese philosopher named Wang Bi, who died at 23 and whose commentary transformed how the whole tradition was read, interpreted the Tao Te Ching through the lens of Wu non-being. In Wang Bi's reading, the way, the Tao, is the ground of all things specifically because it is nothing. Not a thing among things, not a force or a substance, but the principle of non-being from which being arises. The Tao is not the totality of existence. It is the condition for existence, the absence of thingness that makes things possible. This is a metaphysical reading, not a naturalistic one, and it aligns structurally with the apophatic traditions, with Eckhart's Godhead that is beyond being, with Ibn Arabi's absolute prior to all determination. The Heshangong commentary, attributed to a Han Dynasty figure whose date remains debated, reads the same 81 chapters in a radically different direction. In Heshangong's interpretation, the Tao is the vital breath within the body, and the text is a guide to physiological cultivation, to conserving the original vital substance, to connecting the rhythm of the individual with the rhythm of heaven and earth, the same characters, the same text, produce a completely different teaching, not about ontological ground, about the first-person fact of the living breath. The practitioner's Tao is not the metaphysician's Tao. This divergence within a single tradition is instructive. The Tao Te Ching contains both, and the tradition itself could not decide which Tao it was describing, because both descriptions point at something the other capture only partially. The metaphysician's Tao is the ground prior to form. The practitioner's Tao is the breath that connects the body to the movement of the larger whole. One points toward the structure of reality, the other points toward the structure of experience, and both point at the question that physics, at its frontier, cannot answer from the outside. What is established by all of this is not what it might seem to establish. These traditions, Yogacara and Dzogchen within Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism within the Hindu streams, Ibn Arabi within Islam, Eckhart within Christianity, the Tao Te Ching within the Taoist tradition, arrived at their conclusions by methods physics cannot evaluate and did not seek to evaluate. Some used sustained logical argument, some used contemplative practice, years and decades of it, in conditions designed to strip the mind of its ordinary habits. Some used both. Some transmitted their findings only to those who had undergone the practice. The diversity of the methods is as striking as the convergence of the findings, and the findings do converge, not on vagueness, but on something architecturally specific. Beneath the surface of ordinary mental experience, there is a substrate that conditions the surface. Beneath that substrate, several traditions locate something that is not itself produced, a ground that is not made, an awareness that does not arise the way thoughts arise. The produced world of ordinary experience appears within something that does not itself appear in the ordinary way. This is not a mystical sentiment. It is a structural claim held with precision by each tradition in its own language. This is not proof of anything. Independent investigations converging on a structural pattern does not confirm the pattern is real. It may be that the shape of human cognition itself tends toward certain conclusions when it is pressed to its limits, that the contemplative traditions document the limits of the mind rather than something that exceeds them. That possibility must be held alongside the other possibility, that what sustained first-person inquiry, applied with precision and discipline, keeps finding at its depth is something that physics keeps arriving at from the outside, from the other direction. Two roads, the same edge. These traditions were not doing physics. They were not predicting quantum mechanics. The convergence between Dzogchen's unproduced ground and the hard problem's irreducible experience is not prophecy. The convergence between Ibn Arabi's self-disclosing being and Wheeler's participatory universe is not confirmation. The languages are different. The methods are incomparable. The questions were not the same, but the shape is the same, and the shape has been found from both sides, precisely enough to be named. Not all is one. Not consciousness creates reality. Not the ancient knew what the modern has discovered. These are the flattened versions, the versions that cost nothing to hold. The actual shape is more demanding. Awareness is not produced from the non-aware. The ground conditions what appears, but is not itself a product of the appearing. The subject is not a residue at the edge of the physical description, but something the physical description requires and cannot contain. That is the shape. And it was found again and again by people who were not in contact with each other, using methods that have nothing in common, in languages with no shared vocabulary. The convergence is a datum. What the datum means is the question that neither road has answered. So what does all of this mean? Not for the laboratory, not for the tradition, but for the question that sent the physicist to the particle accelerator and the contemplative to the silent room. The question that appears at the center of every human life and never fully resolves afterward. Why is there something it is like to be inside the universe rather than simply being part of it? The investigation has moved through 100 years of physics, through the debate over what a measurement is and what it implies about reality, through the biology of what the brain does and the philosophy of why what the brain does should be felt, through the quantum mechanics of photons in ancient bacteria and electrons in the eyes of birds, through the most technically demanding contemplative traditions on Earth and what their inner teachings actually say. The investigation has not resolved the question. The question is not closer to resolution than it was when Nagel asked about the bat in 1974. What has changed is the precision of the standing. The open ground is the same. Its shape is now clearer. You have been moving through all of this for some time now. Perhaps awake for parts of it, perhaps drifting for others. The content is the same either way. The question does not require wakefulness. It was here before wakefulness and will be here after. It is in some sense the precondition for there being a here at all. Here is the honest accounting. Not a verdict. There is no verdict to give, but a standing as precise as possible on what has actually been shown, what the evidence merely suggests, and what remains. Honestly and without apology, unknown. What is established is specific, and precision in both directions is required. Honesty means naming what has been proved as clearly as naming what has not. The neural correlates of consciousness are real. They are mapped with increasing resolution. Specific brain regions, specific oscillatory patterns, specific conditions of firing track the presence and content of conscious experience across different states, different lesions, different conditions of wakefulness and anesthesia. The binocular rivalry paradigm, the posterior hot zone, the documented dissociations between processing and experience in blindsight and anososnoia and prosopagnosia. These are not speculations. The footprint is there. The correspondence between specific brain activity and specific experience is not in doubt. Francis Crick spent the last week of his life working on the claustrum. That degree of commitment, from that degree of rigor, does not pursue a phantom. The neural basis of consciousness is real and is being mapped. Anesthesia reliably and reversibly removes consciousness. Agents that bind to proteins and disrupt their function eliminate the felt interior while leaving many physiological processes intact. Whatever consciousness is, it is tied to physical process in a way that can be interrupted and restored. This is a constraint on what consciousness can be, not an explanation of what it is, but it is an established constraint. Some biological systems exploit quantum effects in warm, wet tissue. The radical pair mechanism in avian magnetoreception is documented and specific. Two entangled electrons in the retina of a bird are sensitive to the geometry of the Earth's magnetic field and the disruption of their quantum spin dynamics by radio frequency fields at the right frequency disrupts the bird's magnetic compass. This is not a theoretical proposal awaiting confirmation. It is confirmed. The warm-wet objection to quantum biology has a hole in it, and the hole is a fact. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics is genuine and has not been resolved in the 95 years since von Neumann formalized it. The two modes of quantum evolution, the smooth deterministic flow and the sudden, probabilistic settling at measurement, cannot be derived from each other. This is not a presentation problem or a naming problem or a gap in intuition. It is a structural incompatibility between two rules in the same formalism. Every interpretation of quantum mechanics is a proposal for managing this gap. No interpretation has achieved consensus. The gap is in the structure, and the structure is the theory. and the hard problem is real. The explanatory gap between any physical description of a brain process and the felt quality that description is supposed to account for is not a gap awaiting better data. It is structural. A complete description of the mechanism produces no term for the felt. This has been established not as a temporary ignorance, but as a standing architectural fact, named and re-examined by every serious investigator of consciousness for half a century, and never once narrowed by the accumulation of neural or quantum data. A correlate is not an origin. Finding where the footprint is does not say what the foot is. This is what is established. There is a pause worth taking here, before the territory shifts. What is established is less than the popular accounts usually claim, and more than the skeptical dismissals allow. The neural basis of consciousness is real. The quantum effects in biology are real. The measurement problem is real. The hard problem is real. These are not findings that await confirmation. They are the established ground on which everything else stands, or fails to stand, and they leave the central question exactly where it began. What is the felt, and where does it come from? And is the demand for an origin even the right demand that the evidence points toward without reaching? It would be dishonest to dismiss it. It would be equally dishonest to claim it as proof. What is suggested by the family of interpretations that take the observer seriously is that the first-person perspective cannot be cleanly removed from the foundations of physics without something going wrong. Cubism says the wave function is an agent's personal expectation, not a picture of objective reality, and the theory is therefore irreducibly about the experiencing agent rather than about a world the agent observes from outside. Wheeler said, "The universe acquires definite properties only through acts of questioning, and the act of asking is woven into the fabric of the answer." Relational quantum mechanics says, physical properties exist only relative to observers, and there is no observer-independent view from nowhere. These are not the same proposals. They are held by serious physicists who disagree with each other on many points, and they converge on this. The subject is not a philosophical residue at the edge of the physics. It is load-bearing. Remove it, and something essential about the formalism is lost. What is suggested by integrated information theory and the family of panpsychist positions is that experience may not be confined to the specific biological structures we call nervous systems, that wherever there is a structure with the right kind of integrated causal organization, there is some degree of the felt. The 2023 adversarial collaboration that tested this head-to-head against the global neuronal workspace model left the question exactly where it found it genuinely open, with predictions of both theories partially confirmed and partially not. The theory has not been vindicated. It has not been refuted. The possibility that consciousness is graded and present at degrees across structures far simpler than the brain is a serious possibility, not a fringe one. What is suggested by the structural convergence across the contemplative traditions is that careful first-person inquiry, applied with rigor and sustained over years, finds a specific architectural shape, something prior to the produced, something that does not arise the way thoughts arise, something that the investigation of awareness encounters when it presses past the surface. Operations of mind, the Yogacara school, the Dzogchen lineage, Advaita Vedanta, the Pratyabhijna school of Kashmir, Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, Eckhart's theology, Wang Bi's reading of the Tao Te Ching, 7 distinct traditions in 7 different languages, with no knowledge of each other, developed by people who disagreed about almost everything, and all of them locate something at the foundation of awareness that is not itself a product of awareness. This convergence is not vague, it is architecturally specific. The claim is the same. The methods for arriving at it have nothing in common. What is suggested by all of this together is that the standard materialist picture, in which consciousness is a late and local product of physical complexity, produced by brains and absent from everything else, may not be adequate to everything that careful investigation has found. Not wrong, necessarily. Not adequate. Suggestion is not comfortable. Suggestion is precisely where the demand for resolution is loudest and least satisfied. It is the place where the epistemically honest are required to sit with the open question rather than reach for the available answer. And past suggestion, the genuine unknowns, the hard core of what no one knows and what no current method can resolve. The hard problem itself has not moved. It sits exactly where it sat when it was first named. This is worth saying plainly, without the hedging that turns honest ignorance into anticipated progress. The hard problem is not unsolved because the right data has not been collected. It is not unsolved because neuroscience is young or because the instruments are insufficiently precise. It is unsolved at the level of what kind of answer would count. A physical mechanism for consciousness could be found tomorrow, or confirmed, every detail vindicated, and the question would still remain. Why does this mechanism produce experience rather than simply processing information? In the dark, the question survives every mechanism because it is not a question about mechanism. It is a question about what mechanism has to do with felt. There have been proposals for dissolving rather than answering the hard problem. The illusionist position, associated with the philosopher Keith Frankish, that the appearance of a phenomenal quality is itself a kind of cognitive illusion, that what seems like irreducible felt experience is actually a misrepresentation by the brain of its own computational states. On this view, there is no hard problem because there is no phenomenal consciousness to explain, only the illusion of one, which a functional account can, in principle, address. The proposal has been developed with care and argued with rigor. It has also been noticed that the illusion, if it exists, is the most comprehensive and inescapable illusion in the universe, that the very quality of seeming to have an inner life is the only thing that cannot be doubted from the inside. Whether this constitutes a dissolution of the hard problem or a reformulation of it is not settled. What remains genuinely unknown is whether the question, where did consciousness come from, is even well formed. The question assumes that consciousness arrived, that there was a condition in which it was absent, and a condition in which it was present, and that the transition is what needs explaining. But this assumption is under genuine pressure. The contemplative traditions, by convergent independent roots, kept arriving at the claim that what they were looking at was not produced, not arrived, not assembled from components, but prior to production in a sense that the word prior barely captures. If this is not a mystical sentiment but a precise structural claim, then the demand for an origin story may be directing the inquiry at a confusion. It may be that consciousness is not the kind of thing that came from anywhere, and if so, the centuries of inquiry into its origin have been asking the wrong kind of question. Not because the question is foolish, but because the question contains a category error about the nature of what it is asking about. The physics does not confirm this. The physics cannot confirm or deny it, because the physics describes the structure of what arises and does not describe what arising arises within. But the physics does make the question live in a new way. The interpretations that keep the observer inside the formalism are all, in different ways, finding that the experiencing subject is not derivable from the physical description. Not because physics has failed, Because the subject is what the description is being made for, and it cannot therefore appear in the description as one of the things described. What remains genuinely unknown is the combination problem. If experience is fundamental, how do many small experiences become the single unified field that is the ordinary content of a moment? The question has no agreed answer. No one has fully specified what an answer would look like. It may dissolve, it may not. And what remains genuinely unknown is the most fundamental thing. Whether awareness is a property that emerges from certain physical configurations, or whether physical configurations are appearances within something that was never at any depth without awareness. Both possibilities are consistent with everything physics has established. Neither has been proved or ruled out. The choice cannot currently be made on evidential grounds. It is a question at the foundation of the question. There is a careful objection to everything that has been said, and it deserves to be stated precisely rather than dismissed. The careful materialist would say, the structural convergence between physics and the contemplative traditions says more about the shape of human cognition than about the shape of reality. The mind reaches its limits, and at its limits, it produces the same family of impressions, something prior to the ordinary categories, something that resists derivation, something that cannot be described in terms of what it pervades. This is what rigorous thinking encounters at the boundary of what thinking can do. The contemplatives, by a different route, reached the same boundary. The convergence does not show that there is something real on the other side. It shows that the boundary is a feature of the thinking, not a feature of the territory beyond it. The hard problem may be a hard problem of language and cognition, not a hard problem of reality. This is a real objection. It is intellectually serious. Citing the convergence does not answer it, because the convergence is exactly what it is trying to explain, and it deserves to be held as a live possibility, not deflected. And there is a different objection from a completely different direction, from the careful contemplative. Physics, for all its sophistication, operates entirely within the third-person domain. The instruments, the formalism, the laboratory are objects within the field of awareness. The physicist as observer is a position in a theory, a formal device, a thought experiment, not the witnessing that the traditions have spent millennia investigating. Cubism's agent is a role in a probability calculus. Wheeler's participant is a concept in the philosophy of measurement. The first-person fact of being aware, the irreducibly interior quality that Nagel was pointing at when he asked about the bat, is not the same thing as the observer variable in a quantum mechanical equation. The physics has found a formal role for observation. It has not found the inside of the one who observes. This is also a real objection, also intellectually serious, also deserving of an honest hearing. The honest position holds both without collapsing into either. Neither road has crossed the threshold. Physics has arrived at the edge of what physical description can say, and the edge is real. The traditions have arrived at the edge of what first-person description can say, and that edge is also real. Whether the two edges are the same edge, whether the silence of the physics and the silence of the contemplative are two expressions of the same. Depth is not something that can be determined from either side. This is the standing, not certainty, not defeat, not comfort, the open ground. There is something that does not need to be proved to be known. You have been in front of this question, not in a laboratory, not in a monastery, in the ordinary moments that pass without being categorized, without being filed away as evidence for any theory. The moment of looking up at a clear night sky and feeling not exactly small, but something stranger, as if the vastness were not outside you, but something you were inside. and the being inside was itself the most remarkable fact. But the feeling that the looking and the looked at were somehow the same event, and that the separation between them was not as absolute as ordinary life suggested. The moment of sitting in a room at night, so quiet that the silence seemed to have substance, as if stillness were not the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, something that filled what the sound had been filling. There is something in the quiet that is not accounted for. The materialist account does not have a name for it. The mystic's account reaches for names that come close but not close enough. The felt fact remains before the accounts and after them. The experience, perhaps once, perhaps repeatedly, of a recognition that preceded the thought about the recognition. A knowing that arrived without the ordinary process of knowing. The sudden noticing in the middle of an unremarkable afternoon that something is aware. Not the thoughts which are noticed, the awareness that notices them, present before the thought about it, present without requiring the thought about it. Something that has been here quietly for as long as anything has been anything. There is also the simpler and more persistent fact that reading these words or hearing them is happening, that this moment, whatever it contains, is experienced, that the machinery of the universe, which operates in the dark without requiring a felt interior, is here, not in the dark. This is not a discovery made by following the argument. It is the thing the argument has been about from the beginning. The argument circles it. The argument cannot enter it. Whatever these moments are, they are not nothing. They are the thing that every road in this investigation was trying to describe from a different direction. The physicist, looking in through the glass of the formalism, the contemplative, looking out from the inside of the recognition. You have been standing in your own way at the same threshold, not with the physicist's equations and not with the contemplative's discipline, with the ordinary life and the ordinary moments of strangeness that punctuate it, and the question that lives in the strangeness. These moments do not prove anything. That is not why they matter. They matter because they are the direct encounter with the thing that both roads have been circling. The interior fact, the felt presence, the awareness that contains the question of its own origin. No theory closes around it. No account captures it without remainder, and it does not wait to be captured. The standing is this. The question is real. The open ground is real. And the honest position at the end of the inquiry is the same as the honest position at the beginning, but more clearly seen. There is no solution waiting to be announced. There is no comfortable resolution that has been earned and withheld. The silence at the end of the physics and the silence at the end of the tradition are not failures. They are what is found when the investigation has been conducted with full rigor, without retreat into the comfortable versions, to the end of what can be said, and the end of what can be said is a beginning. It is the place where the investigation stops, and the thing being investigated remains, present, undescribed, prior to every description that has been attempted. It began with a simple fact. Nothing in the equations of physics says that anything should be felt. The machinery works in the dark. The wave function evolves, and the fields ripple, and the particles bind and scatter across 13 billion years of a universe assembling itself. And nowhere in any of it is there a symbol for the specific quality of a late afternoon, or the ache at the back of a long week, or the precise character of blue. The investigation that followed did not change this. The equations are still silent on the felt. The mechanisms are mapped and the correlates are found, and the quantum effects in warm tissue are documented, and the felt is still left over, standing outside every description, looking in. The investigation has clarified where the silence is, not in the data, but in the structure of what data can say. It has clarified what kind of question the hard problem is. Not a question about mechanism, but a question about what mechanism has to do with the interior of being. It has shown that the contemplative traditions were pressing at the silence from the other side and arriving at the same edge and describing what they found there with precision the popular versions of their teachings do not transmit. What the investigation has not done is cross the threshold. Neither road has crossed it. Both roads are clear now, and their direction is clear. And the threshold they are pointing toward is the same threshold. The threshold between what can be described from outside and what can only be recognized from inside. The description runs out. The recognition does not have a description to give. Two roads, both ending in silence. Not the same silence. The physics has its silence, and the tradition has its own. And they are shaped by different centuries of inquiry and different methods and different failures. But they sit, from their respective sides, at what may be the same depth. What remains is what was always here, before the physics and before the silence, before the long centuries of sitting in stillness and asking, before the laboratories and the instruments and the published findings. The awareness in which all of it appeared and continues to appear, not reached by the inquiry, present to it. The ground that the inquiry has been standing on the whole time, looking for the ground. The questions are resting. They are not resolved. They are resting, as they have always rested, in the place they are asking about. Not as frustrations, as the shape of the depth. The equations are still silent on this. They describe everything that happens and say nothing about the fact that any of it is felt, and that silence, as old as physics and far older, is not the absence of an answer, but the exact shape of the place where the answer, if there is one, would have to live.